At 9,000 feet over the Belgian coast on December 23, 1944, Lieutenant Jack Morrison watched his fuel gauge needle drop below 30 gallons while 8 German fighters climbed toward his crippled P-47. The math was simple and cruel. 15 minutes of fuel remained, but his 3 bombers needed 20 minutes to reach friendly lines, and the enemy closed the gap at 300 feet per second. Morrison's wingman was already gone, spiraling into the clouds with black smoke trailing behind. The bomber crews were counting on him. Every second he stayed meant one less second to get home, but turning away now meant leaving 40 men to face those guns alone. How long could one pilot hold off 8? Morrison pushed the throttle forward and felt the big fighter surge ahead. The engine roared louder, drinking fuel faster, cutting into his 15 minutes. He could see the bombers below, 3 B-17s flying in a tight formation, their silver bodies catching the morning light. They looked small and slow from up here. The German fighters were climbing fast. Morrison counted them again. 8 dark shapes against the clouds. They flew in 2 groups of 4, one high and one low. That formation meant trouble. His radio crackled to life. The bomber lead was calling for help. Morrison keyed his mic and told them he was still there. The bomber pilot's voice came back, grateful but worried. He asked about the wingman. Morrison said nothing about that. There was nothing to say. He checked his fuel gauge again. 28 gallons now. The needle kept moving left. The first German fighter broke away from the high group and dove. Morrison saw the wings catch sunlight, saw the black crosses on the fuselage. The enemy pilot was diving fast, building speed for the attack. Morrison turned hard to meet him. The G-forces pressed him into his seat. His vision narrowed at the edges, grey creeping in. He eased off just enough to keep his sight clear. The German fighter opened fire at long range. Tracers arced past Morrison's canopy. Bright streaks in the cold air. Morrison held his fire and kept turning. The enemy committed too early, shooting from too far away. They passed each other at a combined speed of 600 miles per hour. Morrison felt the turbulence from the other plane, a sudden bump that rattled his cockpit. Then the German was behind him, trying to turn around for another pass. Morrison reversed his turn and climbed. The P-47 was heavy but strong. It climbed slowly but steadily. The German fighter followed, lighter and faster in the turn. But Morrison knew his plane could take punishment that would tear apart anything else in the sky. 2 more German fighters dove from above. Morrison saw them coming and rolled away. Tracers followed him, stitching through the air where he had been a second before. The bombers were still flying straight and level below. They could not turn or dive without breaking formation. They just kept flying. Engines droning, bomb bay doors closed. Morrison wondered what the crews were thinking down there, watching him fight alone. He checked his fuel. 26 gallons. 3 minutes gone already. The Germans were smarter now. They did not attack one at a time. 3 fighters came at him together. From different angles, Morrison had to choose which one to face. He picked the closest and fired a short burst. His bullets missed, but the German pilot flinched and broke off. The other 2 kept coming. Morrison pushed his stick forward and dove. Speed built quickly. The altimeter unwound. 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000. Wind screamed past the canopy. The Germans followed but fell behind. The P-47 dove faster than anything. At 4,000 feet, Morrison pulled up hard. The G-forces slammed him down. His vision went grey, then black at the edges. He grunted and tensed his legs and stomach, fighting to stay conscious. Blood forced back into his head. Vision returned. He was below the bombers now. That was wrong. He needed to be above them, between them and the enemy. Morrison climbed again, adding power, burning more fuel. The Germans had split into 3 groups now. 2 fighters stayed high, 3 circled wide to the left. 3 more went right. They were surrounding the bombers, setting up for coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Morrison could not cover all the angles. He flew toward the group on the right, the closest threat. His fuel gauge read 24 gallons. 12 minutes left, maybe less at this power setting. The bomber lead called again. Enemy fighters approaching from the left. Morrison looked and saw them diving. He turned hard, but he was too far away. He would never reach them in time. One of the bombers began firing its guns. Morrison could see traces streaming out from the waist guns. From the top turret, from the tail, the German fighters flew through the fire like it was nothing. One peeled off, smoke trailing from his engine. The others kept coming. Cannon shells hit the lead bomber. Morrison saw flashes of light along the fuselage, pieces of metal tearing away. The bomber lurched but kept flying. Its engines did not falter. Morrison reached the right side group and fired. He aimed at the lead fighter and held the trigger down. His guns hammered, 650 caliber machine guns filling the air with bullets. The German fighter rolled away, but not fast enough. Holes appeared along its wing route. Smoke poured out. The fighter fell away, spinning down. 7 left. Morrison's windscreen was streaked with oil from his damaged engine. Not his engine. The bomber's engine. No, his engine. Something was wrong. He checked his gauges, oil pressure dropping, temperature rising. A bullet or shell fragment must have clipped a line during that first pass. He had bigger problems than oil. Fuel gauge read 22 gallons. The Germans were reforming for another attack. This time they came from above and ahead, diving straight at the bombers in head-on passes. It was the most dangerous attack, the one that gave bomber gunners the hardest shot. Morrison tried to intercept, but they were too fast and too high. They flashed past him and bore down on the B-17S. The bombers opened fire. The sky between them and the enemy fighters filled with tracers. Morrison saw one German take hits in the nose and canopy. The fighter rolled over and dove away, trailing smoke. But the others kept coming, guns blazing. The second bomber in the formation took hits. Morrison watched cannon shells walk across the left wing, tearing through metal, cutting into the fuel tanks. Fire bloomed orange and yellow. The bomber fell out of formation, wing burning, losing altitude fast. The crew bailed out. Morrison counted parachutes. 1, 2, 3, 4. Not enough. There should be 10. The bomber spun down, fire spreading across the wing. It disappeared into the clouds below. 5 left. No, 6. Morrison counted again. 6 German fighters. The bomber lead was calling for him. Morrison answered, but his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Flat. Tired. He told them he was still there. The bomber pilot asked how long until friendly lines. Morrison checked his map and compass. 17 minutes at bomber speed. His fuel gauge read 20 gallons. 13 minutes of flying if he was lucky. 4 minutes short. Morrison knew what that meant. He could stay with the bombers for 13 minutes. Then his engine would quit and he would have to bail out or crash land. He would not make it home. The bombers might make it without him. Maybe. Or he could leave now, fly straight for home and land safely. Let the bombers take their chances. He thought about his wingman, spinning down with black smoke trailing. He thought about the bomber that had just fallen out of the sky. He thought about the 40 men left in the 2 remaining B-17C. Then he pushed the throttle forward again and climbed toward the German fighters. The Germans saw him coming. 3 turned to meet him. 3 kept circling the bombers, waiting for their chance. Morrison picked the middle fighter and fired. The German dodged left. Morrison followed and fired again. This time his bullets found the target. He saw strikes on the fuselage, on the wing, on the engine cowling. The German fighter rolled right and dove. Morrison did not follow. He turned back toward the bombers. Another German fighter was diving on the trailing B-17. Morrison turned to intercept, but he was too far away and too low. The German fired. His cannon shells hit the bomber's right wing, tearing through the outboard engine. The engine caught fire. The propeller windmilled, then seized up. The bomber began to fall behind the formation. Fire spread along the wing. Morrison could see the crew inside, silhouettes moving behind the windows, fighting to control the damage. The fire went out. They had pulled the extinguisher handle. The bomber kept flying on 3 engines, but it was slower now, falling farther behind with each second. That made it an easy target. 2 German fighters turned toward it, sensing weakness. Morrison dove between them and the bomber. He fired at the first German, missed, adjusted, fired again. The German broke left. Morrison turned right and fired at the second fighter. That pilot broke right, away from the bomber. But now Morrison was between the bombers and friendly lines, pointing the wrong direction. He had to turn around. That took time. The Germans used that time to reposition. His fuel gauge read 18 gallons, 10 minutes left. His oil pressure warning light came on, glowing red. The temperature gauge climbed into the red zone. His engine was dying slowly. The bomber lead called again. More enemy fighters approaching from the north. Morrison looked and felt his stomach sink. 4 more fighters, fresh and fast, diving toward them out of the sun. 10 against 1. Morrison checked his ammunition counter. Half gone. He had maybe 30 seconds of firing time left. Not enough. Not nearly enough. He climbed toward the new fighters. They saw him coming and spread out. Morrison picked one and fired a short burst. The German dodged and fired back. Tracers crossed in the space between them. Morrison jerked his stick left. Bullets cracked past his canopy, so close he could hear them over the engine noise. His plane shuddered. Something hit him from behind. He smelled smoke. His oil pressure gauge dropped to 0. Temperature gauge pinned at maximum. The engine started making a grinding noise. Metal on metal, death sounds. Morrison looked back and saw a German fighter on his tail. Guns flashing. He rolled right and pulled hard. The G-forces crushed him down. Grey vision again. He held the turn, waiting for the world to come back into focus. When his vision cleared, the German fighter was gone. Morrison looked around and saw it diving away, trailing white smoke. Another fighter was burning. Morrison had not shot it. Someone else had. He looked down and saw the bombers. Their gunners were firing at everything that came close. But there were too many Germans. 9 fighters circled the 2 bombers like sharks. They attacked from every angle, diving in, firing, breaking away, climbing back up to attack again. The bombers fired back, but they could not stop them all. The lead bomber took hits in the nose. Morrison saw the glass shatter, saw the bomber lurch. The bomber's guns fell silent. Then, slowly, the guns came back to life. Someone in the crew had taken over for the dead or wounded nose gunner. Morrison's engine quit. The propeller windmilled for a few seconds, then froze. The sudden silence was shocking. He could hear the wind rushing past the canopy, hear his own breathing inside the oxygen mask, hear his heart pounding. Nothing else. He pushed the nose down to maintain speed. The P-47 became a glider, heavy and falling. Altitude would give him time, but eventually he would hit the ground. He was at 7,000 feet. That gave him maybe 10 minutes, if he glided efficiently. But he could still do something in 10 minutes. Morrison pointed his nose at the nearest German fighter, and dove, speed built quickly. He had no power, but gravity was enough. The German did not see him at first. When the pilot finally looked up and saw Morrison diving on him, it was too late. Morrison fired. His guns still worked. Electricity from the battery powered them. Bullets poured out. The German fighter came apart, wings folding, fuselage breaking, pieces tumbling through the sky. 8 left. Morrison pulled out of the dive at 5,000 feet. He had lost altitude, but he had speed now. He turned that speed into a climb, trading velocity for height. The P-47 rose back up to 6,000 feet before the speed bled off. Another German fighter came at him. Morrison turned to meet him. They flew at each other head-on. Neither pilot flinched. Both opened fire at the same moment. Tracers met in the middle. Metal struck metal. Morrison felt impacts along his wing. Then they flashed past each other. Morrison checked his wing. There were holes, but nothing critical. He looked back at the German fighter. It was trailing smoke from the engine, pulling up and away from the fight. 7 left. He glided down toward the bombers. They were lower now, descending gradually toward friendlier airspace, but they were still 5 minutes away from the lines. Morrison had maybe 6 minutes of gliding time left before he had to jump or crash. The Germans knew his engine was dead. They ignored him and focused on the bombers. 3 fighters lined up for a coordinated attack, coming from the left side where the wounded bomber could not maneuver away. Morrison dove toward them, trading altitude for speed again. He came in behind the trailing German and fired. His aim was good. Bullets hit the fighter's tail and fuselage. The German pilot pulled up and away, breaking off the attack. The other 2 kept coming. They fired at the wounded bomber. Cannon shells walked across the wing, across the fuselage, across the cockpit. Glass shattered. Metal tore. The bomber nosed over and began to fall. Parachutes blossomed. Morrison counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Still not enough. The bomber fell faster, spinning now, pieces breaking off. It disappeared into the clouds. 1 bomber left. Morrison was at 4,000 feet. The remaining B-17 was at 3,000. The German fighters circled like vultures, 6 of them now waiting for the right moment to strike. Morrison had 1 magazine of ammunition left, maybe 20 seconds of firing time. He glided toward the nearest fighter. But something strange happened. The German fighters broke off their attack. They turned away, climbing to the north. Morrison did not understand at first. Then he looked ahead and saw them friendly fighters. 8 P-51 Mustangs coming from the west at high speed. The Germans ran. They were outnumbered now, low on fuel and ammunition, too far from home. The Mustangs chased them, but the Germans scattered and dove and disappeared into the clouds. The Mustang leader called Morrison on the radio. He asked if Morrison was all right. Morrison looked at his dead engine, his low altitude, his empty fuel tanks. He keyed the mic and said he was fine, but he needed to land soon. The Mustang pilot laughed and said there was a field 5 miles ahead. Morrison looked and saw it. A small Allied airstrip carved into the Belgian countryside. He could glide that far. Maybe. He set up his approach. The P-47 dropped steadily. 2,000 feet, 1,000 feet, 500 feet. The runway appeared ahead. A thin strip of packed dirt. Morrison dropped his landing gear. The wheels locked down. No hydraulic pressure, but gravity worked. He glided over the fence. The runway rushed up. His wheels touched, bounced, touched again. The tail wheel dropped. He rolled straight. No brakes, just letting friction slow him down. The P-47 rolled to a stop at the far end of the runway. Morrison shut down the electrical system and sat in the sudden silence. His hands were shaking. His legs felt weak. He tried to stand and could not. He sat back down and waited for the shaking to stop. The bomber flew overhead, engines roaring, heading west. The crew radioed their thanks. Morrison waved from the cockpit, but they were too far away to see him. Ground crew arrived, a jeep bouncing across the grass. They pulled him out of the cockpit. Someone asked if he was hurt. Morrison said, no. Someone else asked how many he got. Morrison said he did not know. 3, maybe 4. They told him the bomber made it home safely. All 20 men aboard. Not a scratch on them. Morrison nodded. That was good. That made it worth it. Almost. He thought about his wingman, spinning down through the clouds. He thought about the 2 bombers that did not make it. 20 men dead. Maybe more. He had saved 20, lost 20. The math did not add up to victory. It just added up to survival. They loaded him into the jeep and drove him to the operations tent. Someone handed him coffee. Someone else handed him a mission report form. Morrison stared at the blank paper. He did not know what to write. The Mustang leader came in, still wearing his flight gear. He sat down next to Morrison and said it was good work up there. Morrison said it did not feel like good work. The Mustang pilot said it never did, but the bomber crew thought it was good work, and that was what mattered. Morrison asked about the bombers that went down. The Mustang pilot said search and rescue planes were already looking for survivors. Maybe some made it. Maybe they were prisoners now, but alive. Maybe. Morrison wrote his report. He kept it simple. Intercepted 8 enemy fighters, engaged until reinforcements arrived, landed at forward base with no fuel and engine damage. He did not write about the 20 men who died. He did not write about the math problem at 9,000 feet, the choice between staying and leaving. He just wrote the facts. When he finished, the operations officer told him to rest. They would get him back to his unit in the morning. Morrison walked to the tent they gave him and lay down on a cot. He closed his eyes, but could not sleep. He kept seeing his fuel gauge, the needle dropping, the numbers counting down. 15 minutes, 12 minutes, 10 minutes. Never enough time, never enough fuel, never enough. Outside he heard engines starting. More missions going out. More fighters climbing into the cold sky. The war did not stop because Morrison was tired. It did not stop because men died. It just kept going, day after day, mission after mission, until it was finally over. Morrison lay on the cot and listened to the engines fade into the distance. Then slowly, he fell asleep. He dreamed about falling. He dreamed about fire. He dreamed about his fuel gauge reading 0, and the engine quitting, and the long glide down to the ground. When he woke up, it was morning and the dreams faded, but the fuel gauge was still there in his mind, needle dropping, numbers counting down. He knew it would always be there, even after the war ended, even after he went home. That gauge would never read full again. Not really. Not in the ways that mattered. But he got up anyway. He put on his flight suit. He reported to the operations tent. They had a transport plane ready to take him back to his unit. Morrison climbed aboard and sat in the canvas seat, looking out the window as the plane lifted off. Below he could see the runway, the tents, the mechanics working on fighters. Everything looked small from up here. The transport flew west, following the bomber routes home. Morrison watched the ground pass below. Somewhere down there, his wingman had crashed. Somewhere down there, 2 bombers had gone down. He could not see the wreckage from this altitude. Maybe that was better. They landed at his home base 2 hours later. Morrison walked across the field to his squadron's area. Other pilots saw him and waved. Someone asked where he had been. Morrison said he made an unplanned stop. They laughed. Everyone made unplanned stops eventually. That was the nature of the war. You planned for everything, and then something went wrong, and you adapted or died. The squadron commander called Morrison into his office. He wanted a verbal report, something more than the written form. Morrison told him everything. The fuel situation, the 8 German fighters, the decision to stay, the engine failure, the glide to the forward base. The commander listened without interrupting. When Morrison finished, the commander asked if he would do it again, knowing what he knew now. Morrison thought about that. Would he make the same choice? Stay with the bombers, burn fuel he did not have? Fight 8-1? Morrison said yes. He would do it again. The commander nodded and said that was the right answer. Then he told Morrison to take the rest of the day off. Morrison saluted and left. He walked to his quarters, a small room shared with 3 other pilots. His wingman's bunk was empty. Someone had already packed up his belongings, ready to ship them home. Morrison sat on his own bunk and stared at that empty bed. They had flown together for 6 months, trained together, fought together. Now Morrison flew alone. Tomorrow there would be a new wingman, someone younger and less experienced. Morrison would teach him the same lessons he learned. Watch your fuel, watch your six, keep your speed up, never leave your bombers. Some of those lessons would stick, some would not. Some pilots learned fast. Some never got the chance. That night, Morrison did not dream. He slept deeply and woke to the sound of engines warming up before dawn. Another mission day. He dressed in the dark, walked to the flight line, and stood looking at his assigned fighter. It was not the same P-47 he flew yesterday. That one was still at the forward base, awaiting repairs. This one was older, the paint worn, the canopy scratched, but the fuel tanks were full. That was what mattered. Morrison climbed into the cockpit and went through his checks. Engine, instruments, controls, guns, everything worked. He started the engine and felt the familiar vibration. The propeller spun, faster and faster, until it blurred into a disc. Morrison taxied to the runway and waited for clearance. The radio crackled. Tower cleared him for takeoff. Morrison advanced the throttle and felt the fighter accelerate. Tail up, stick back, wheels off the ground. He climbed into the grey morning sky. Below, the base shrank to a collection of tiny buildings. Morrison checked his fuel gauge. Full tanks, 90 gallons. Enough for 2 hours of flying, maybe more if he was careful. Today he would be careful. Today he would bring everyone home. Himself, his new wingman, the bombers. Today the math would work out. It had to. He leveled off at 10,000 feet and waited for the rest of his flight to catch up. They formed up in a loose line, 4 fighters flying south toward Germany. Somewhere ahead, bombers were assembling for their mission. Morrison and his flight would meet them over Belgium, escort them to the target, and bring them home. Simple plan, clean mission. Nothing would go wrong. But Morrison checked his fuel gauge again anyway. 88 gallons. Still plenty. He would check it again in 10 minutes, then 10 minutes after that. He would always check it. The war had taught him that lesson. Never trust the numbers. Never assume you have enough. Always count the cost before you commit. They crossed the front lines at 20,000 feet. The bombers were forming up below, dozens of them, silver shapes catching the sun. Morrison's radio crackled. Bomber lead checking in, acknowledging the escort. Morrison responded. His voice was steady, professional. It gave no hint of the memories from yesterday. The fuel gauge dropping, the 8 German fighters closing in. That was yesterday. This was today. Different mission, different odds, different fuel load. Today would be different. Except it was not different. At 30 minutes into the mission, Morrison's radio picked up a call. Enemy fighters, 12 of them. Climbing from the north, Morrison's stomach clenched. He checked his fuel gauge. 70 gallons. Plenty of fuel. Enough to fight, enough to run, enough to get home. But the numbers made him nervous anyway. The German fighters came in fast. Morrison's flight turned to meet them. This time Morrison had 3 wingmen, not flying alone. This time his tanks were full, his engines strong. The fight would be different. It had to be. But war did not care about fairness or second chances. The German fighters were good, experienced pilots who knew all the same tricks Morrison knew. They split his flight up, separating the fighters, forcing each pilot to fight alone. Morrison lost sight of his wingmen in seconds. He was alone again, turning and climbing and diving, trying to keep the bombers safe while not getting shot down himself. His fuel gauge dropped. 65 gallons. 60, 55. Each maneuver burned fuel. Each turn, each climb, each burst of speed. The numbers kept counting down, just like yesterday. Morrison tried not to look at the gauge, but his eyes kept drifting to it. The needle moved left, always left, never right. He shot down 1 German fighter, then another. His guns worked perfectly. His aim was good, but there were still 10 more, and his fuel gauge read 50 gallons now, and the bombers were still 20 minutes from the target, 40 minutes from home. The math started going wrong again. Morrison radioed his flight leader, told him about the fuel situation. The leader told him to head home if he needed to. Morrison looked down at the bombers. They were taking fire, German fighters diving on them from all angles. Morrison's flight was scattered, each pilot fighting his own battle. The bombers needed help. Morrison checked his fuel gauge one more time. 48 gallons. Enough to get home if he left right now. Not enough if he stayed. He thought about yesterday, about the choice he made, about the engine quitting, and the long glide down. He thought about his wingman spinning into the clouds. Then he pushed his throttle forward and dove toward the German fighters. The fuel gauge dropped. The engine roared. The fight continued. Morrison had made his choice again. Same choice, same risk, same uncertain outcome, but this time felt different somehow. This time he was not afraid of the fuel gauge. He was not afraid of the math. He had already survived the worst day. Today could not be worse than that. And he was right. The German fighters broke off when Allied reinforcements arrived. The bombers continued to their target and dropped their bombs. Morrison escorted them all the way home, landing with 10 gallons of fuel left. Enough, just barely enough. In the debrief, the squadron commander asked Morrison why he stayed when his fuel was low. Morrison said the bombers needed him. The commander asked if Morrison thought he was invincible now, surviving yesterday's mission. Morrison said no, he was not invincible. He was just careful with his math. The commander smiled at that. He told Morrison he was recommending him for a medal. Morrison said that was not necessary. The commander said it was absolutely necessary. Morrison had saved 40 lives over 2 missions fighting against impossible odds. That deserved recognition. Morrison did not feel like he deserved anything. He felt like he had just done his job, but he accepted the commander's decision and left the office. Outside, his new wingman was waiting. He wanted advice, wanted to know how Morrison had survived so many missions. Morrison thought about that question. How had he survived? Luck, mostly. Skill, partly. But also something else. Some quality he could not name. Some ability to make the hard choice and live with the consequences. He told his wingman to always watch his fuel gauge. Everything else would sort itself out, but fuel was the one thing you could not get more of in the air. The wingman nodded and said he would remember that. Morrison hoped he would. He hoped this wingman would last longer than the previous one. He hoped the war would end before they ran out of young pilots willing to climb into fighters and fly into impossible situations. That night, Morrison lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. He thought about fuel gauges and choices and math problems that did not add up. He thought about the 20 men he saved and the 20 men he could not save. He thought about tomorrow's mission, and the mission after that, and all the missions yet to come. There would be more low-fuel situations, more impossible choices, more 8-to-1 fights. That was the nature of this war. It kept asking the same questions over and over, and Morrison kept giving the same answers. But tonight he was alive, and the bombers were home, and the fuel gauge in his mind finally read full. Not really full. He knew that, but full enough to face tomorrow, full enough to climb back into the cockpit and do it all again, full enough to keep fighting until the war finally ended, and the questions stopped coming, and the fuel gauge could rest at 0 without anyone dying. Morrison closed his eyes and drifted toward sleep. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, new fuel gauges counting down. But tonight he rested. Tonight he was home. Tonight the math had worked out. And that was enough. That had to be enough. Because the alternative was thinking too much about all the times the math would not work out, all the missions where the fuel would run dry too soon, all the choices that ended badly. Morrison had already lived through one of those days. He had survived. That was all anyone could ask for. In this war, survival. One more day, one more mission, one more landing with fuel still in the tanks. He would take that deal every time, even knowing the cost, even knowing the odds, because the alternative was not fighting at all, and Morrison was not ready for that. Not yet. Not while bombers still needed escorts and fuel gauges still had numbers above zero. Sleep came slowly, but it came, and in the morning Morrison woke and dressed and walked to the flight line and climbed into his fighter. The fuel gauge read full, the engine started. The mission briefing was clear. Everything was ready. Morrison taxied to the runway and took off into the dawn. Below him, the base fell away. Ahead, the sky waited, grey and cold and full of German fighters. Morrison climbed toward it all, checking his fuel gauge one more time before crossing the lines. Full tanks. Enough to fight. Enough to win. Enough to come home. Today the math would work out. He would make sure of it. The war continued. The fuel gauges kept counting down. Morrison kept flying. That was all there was. That was all there would ever be, until the final mission, until the last landing, until the war finally ended, and the fuel could last forever because no one needed to fight anymore. Morrison looked forward to that day, but until it came, he would keep checking his gauge, keep making the hard choices, keep bringing the bombers home, because that was his job. That was what mattered. Everything else was just numbers on a dial, counting down to zero or counting up to full. And Morrison had learned how to make those numbers work, most of the time. That was enough. He flew east into the sun. The bombers were forming up ahead. His wingman called on the radio, checking in. Morrison acknowledged. Together they climbed to meet the bombers. Together they would bring them home. The fuel gauge read 85 gallons. The engine ran smoothly. The guns were loaded. Everything was ready. Morrison was ready. Today he would do his job. Tomorrow he would do it again. That was the pattern now. That was his life. Fuel and fighters and choices and consequences. He had made peace with it. He had no other choice. But the pattern broke 2 days later. Morrison was assigned a different mission. Not bomber escort, but fighter sweep over German-held territory. 8 P-47s flying low and fast, hunting for targets on the ground. Trucks, trains, anything that moved. It was dangerous work, flying low where German anti-aircraft guns could reach them. But it was also effective. Every truck destroyed was one less supplying the German front lines. Morrison briefed his flight before dawn. The mission called for them to fly east at low altitude, following roads and rail lines, looking for German supply convoys. Intelligence reported heavy traffic in their assigned sector. Morrison told his pilots to stay alert, keep their spacing tight, and watch for anti-aircraft fire. He told them to save their ammunition for worthwhile targets. No shooting at single trucks or staff cars. They needed to find convoys, concentrations of vehicles worth the risk of ground fire. His new wingman asked how low they would fly. Morrison said, low enough to see faces in the trucks. The wingman looked nervous. Morrison understood. Low flying meant high risk. Anti-aircraft gunners loved targets below 2,000 feet. One good burst could bring down a fighter, but high altitude meant missing targets, flying over convoys without seeing them. The mission required low flight. Morrison would lead from the front, show his pilots it could be done. Maybe that would help. Maybe it would not. Either way, they had to fly the mission. They took off in darkness and climbed to 5,000 feet for the flight to the front lines. Morrison checked his instruments repeatedly. Fuel gauge, oil pressure, engine temperature, everything normal. His guns were loaded with armor-piercing rounds, good for punching through truck engines and fuel tanks. He had full ammunition, enough for several long bursts. Morrison planned to make them count. Dawn broke as they crossed friendly lines. The sky turned from black to grey to pale blue. Below, the winter landscape stretched endlessly. Fields and forests and frozen rivers. Everything looked peaceful from altitude. Morrison knew better. German soldiers occupied those forests. German guns waited in those fields. Nothing was peaceful. It just looked that way from 5,000 feet. Morrison flew in the number 2 position, right behind his flight leader. His new wingman flew on his right. The 4th pilot held position on the left. They crossed the front lines at 5,000 feet, then descended to 1,000, dropping lower as they penetrated enemy territory. The ground rushed past below winter fields and frozen roads and villages. Everything looked dead and grey. No movement, no signs of life, just empty landscape stretching to the horizon. The flight leader spotted a convoy, 6 trucks on a narrow road. He called the target and rolled into his attack. Morrison followed. They dove toward the trucks, guns blazing. Tracers reached up from the ground, anti-aircraft fire, but too late. Morrison's bullets walked across the lead truck. It exploded, fire and smoke rising into the cold air. The other trucks scattered, drivers panicking, but there was nowhere to hide on that narrow road. The P-47s made pass after pass until all 6 trucks were burning. Morrison pulled up and checked his fuel. 60 gallons, still plenty. The flight reformed and continued east, looking for more targets. They found a train stopped at a station. The flight leader ordered an attack. Morrison dove again, firing at the locomotive. Steam erupted from burst pipes. The engine died. Other fighters attacked the freight cars. Explosions rippled down the line. Then Morrison saw them, German fighters, 4 of them, diving from above. They must have been waiting, watching, looking for exactly this opportunity. Allied fighters focused on ground targets, low and slow and vulnerable. Morrison shouted a warning into his radio. The flight leader heard and broke hard left. Morrison followed, braking right. His wingman stayed close. The German fighters came fast. Morrison recognized the silhouettes. Focke-Wulf 190s. Dangerous planes flown by experienced pilots. They dove in a coordinated attack. 2 on the flight leader, 2 on Morrison. Classic tactics. Split the formation, isolate targets, kill them quickly. Morrison had used the same tactics himself. Now he was on the receiving end. He pulled back hard on his stick. The P-47 climbed steeply. G-forces pressed him into his seat. His flight suit squeezed his legs, forcing blood to his head. The grey edge crept into his vision. Morrison eased off slightly, keeping his sight clear. He needed to see the enemy. Blind flying got pilots killed. The lead German fighter opened fire at long range. Tracers arced past Morrison's right wing, bright orange against the grey sky. The German was shooting from too far away, wasting ammunition. Morrison waited. He held his fire and kept climbing, making the German commit. The enemy pilot pulled his nose up, trying to track Morrison's climb. That was a mistake. The Focke-Wulf bled energy in a climb. Morrison's heavier P-47 held its speed better. Morrison watched his airspeed indicator. 200 knots, 190, 180. Still enough speed to maneuver. The German was slower now, struggling to keep his nose pointed at Morrison. Morrison saw his chance. He rolled inverted and pulled hard, reversing his climb into a dive. The maneuver was violent and disorienting. Up became down. Sky became ground. Morrison's inner ear protested, but his eyes followed the German fighter. That was all that mattered. The German tried to follow Morrison's reversal. His plane could not handle it. The Focke-Wulf stalled at the top of its climb, nose dropping, losing control for just a moment. Morrison used that moment. He rolled upright and positioned himself behind the German. The enemy pilot saw him coming and shoved his stick forward, diving away. Morrison followed. His finger found the trigger. The German fighters opened fire. Tracers filled the sky. Morrison jinked left and right, making himself a harder target. Bullets cracked past his canopy. He pulled back on his stick and climbed, trading speed for altitude. The German fighters followed. This was their advantage. They had height and speed. Morrison had neither. His flight was scattered now. Each pilot fought alone. Morrison looked for his wingman and found him, still there, climbing with him. Good. At least one pilot had listened to his advice and stayed close. The flight leader was a mile away, turning hard, 3 German fighters on his tail. The other P-47s were even farther, specks against the clouds. Morrison reached 5,000 feet and leveled off. One German fighter was still chasing him. Morrison reversed his turn and met the enemy head-on. They fired at each other. Morrison felt impacts on his wing. The German fighter flashed past, trailing smoke. Morrison did not know if he had scored hits or if someone else had. It did not matter. The German was breaking off. But now his wingman was in trouble. 2 German fighters were on him, taking turns attacking. The wingman twisted and turned, trying to shake them, but they stayed with him. Morrison dove to help. He came in behind the trailing German and fired. The enemy fighter exploded, wings and fuselage coming apart in mid-air. Morrison flew through the debris field, metal pieces bouncing off his canopy. The second German saw Morrison and turned to face him. They circled each other, turning tight, each trying to get behind the other. Morrison's P-47 could not turn as tightly as the German fighter. He knew that, but he also knew his plane could take more damage and keep flying. That gave him options. He rolled inverted and pulled, reversing his turn. The German followed. Morrison rolled upright and reversed again. The German stayed with him. They were locked in a turning fight, burning fuel and energy, going nowhere. Morrison's fuel gauge read 55 gallons. He needed to end this quickly. He stopped turning and flew straight. The German pilot took the bait and followed, lining up for a shot. Morrison waited until the last second, then pulled up hard. The German followed, firing. Bullets hit Morrison's tail and fuselage. Morrison kept pulling tighter and tighter until his vision went grey. The German stayed behind him, firing continuously. Morrison waited for his plane to fall apart, but it did not. The P-47 took the punishment and kept flying. Then the German made a mistake. He pulled too hard, trying to match Morrison's turn. His lighter fighter bled energy faster. Morrison felt it, felt the pressure ease, felt the geometry shift. He reversed his turn one more time and suddenly he was behind the German, not ahead. Morrison fired. His bullets tore through the enemy's engine and cockpit. The German fighter rolled over and dove straight into the ground. Morrison climbed back to altitude. His wingman was safe, the German fighters were gone, and his fuel gauge read 48 gallons. Not critical, but not comfortable either. He radioed his flight leader and heard nothing back. Morrison called again. Still nothing. He looked around the sky and counted P-47s. 6. There should be 8. 2 missing. One of the missing planes was the flight leader. Morrison saw smoke rising from the ground 2 miles south. Someone had gone down. Morrison hoped it was a German, but he knew better. The math was always cruel. You won some, you lost some, and the numbers never balanced. The surviving P-47s regrouped and flew west toward friendly lines. Morrison took the lead position. No one questioned it. When the flight leader went down, the next senior pilot took over. That was Morrison now. He called their base and reported the situation. 2 fighters lost, mission complete, returning home. The radio operator acknowledged. His voice was flat, professional. He had heard this report before. Everyone had heard it before. It happened every day. Morrison landed with 30 gallons of fuel. Enough, but barely. He shut down the engine and sat in the cockpit, waiting for his hands to stop shaking. They did not stop. He climbed out anyway and walked to the debriefing room. The other pilots were already there, talking in low voices. They had all seen the same thing. The flight leader going down, the second plane spinning into the ground. No parachutes, no survivors. The squadron commander asked for Morrison's report. Morrison told him everything. The convoy, the train, the ambush, the fight. Every detail, every decision, every consequence. The commander listened and made notes. His face showed nothing. He had heard reports like this 100 times before. Pilots lost, missions completed, the endless arithmetic of war. When Morrison finished, the commander looked up and told Morrison he was now a flight leader. 4 planes, 4 pilots, Morrison's responsibility. Morrison said he did not want to be a flight leader. The commander said it did not matter what Morrison wanted. They needed experienced pilots in leadership positions. Morrison had the experience. Morrison had survived. Therefore, Morrison led. Morrison wanted to argue. He wanted to explain that survival proved nothing except luck. He wanted to say he did not feel ready to lead anyone. But the words stuck in his throat. What good would arguing do? The commander had made his decision based on cold logic and desperate need. The squadron needed leaders. Morrison was alive and experienced. Those 2 facts outweighed everything else. Morrison saluted and left the office. Outside, the other pilots were standing around, talking quietly. They looked at Morrison differently now. He was a flight leader. That meant something to them. It meant Morrison knew how to survive. It meant following Morrison gave you better odds of coming home. Morrison wanted to tell them that was not true. He wanted to explain that his survival was random, meaningless, not replicable. But they would not believe him. They needed to believe in something. Better they believe in Morrison than nothing at all. So Morrison said nothing and walked to his quarters. That night he tried to sleep, but could not. His mind replayed the day's mission over and over. The ambush, the fight, the decisions. He thought about his flight leader going down. He thought about the second P-47 spinning into the ground. He wondered if he could have saved them. Maybe if he had been more alert, spotted the German fighters sooner, called the warning faster. Maybe if he had positioned himself better, drawn the enemy away. Maybe if he had made different choices. But maybe was a useless word. The past was fixed. The flight leader was dead. The second pilot was dead. Morrison was alive. Those were the facts. Morrison had to accept them and move forward. Tomorrow he would lead. Tomorrow other pilots would depend on him. Tomorrow he would make decisions that determined who lived and who died. Morrison lay in the darkness and tried to prepare himself for that responsibility. He could not. No amount of thinking could prepare someone for that weight. He would just have to carry it and hope he did not collapse. Morrison accepted the assignment because he had no choice. That night he lay on his bunk and thought about fuel gauges and leadership and responsibility. Leading a flight meant being responsible for 3 other pilots, making decisions that kept them alive or got them killed. Morrison did not feel ready for that. He barely felt ready to keep himself alive, but the war did not care about feelings. It cared about results. So Morrison would lead. He would make decisions. He would bring his flight home, or he would die trying. Those were the only options. The next mission came at dawn. Morrison led 4 P-47 Sire on another fighter sweep. This time he kept his flight high, out of range of ground fire. This time he watched the sky constantly, looking for ambushes. This time no one got shot down. They destroyed a fuel depot and strafed an airfield, and came home with all 4 planes intact. Morrison counted that as a victory. But victories did not last. 3 days later, Morrison led his flight on a bomber escort mission. Everything went wrong. German fighters attacked in waves, dozens of them. Morrison's flight shot down 5 before running low on ammunition. They had to break off and head home, leaving the bombers to face the remaining German fighters alone. Morrison watched from a distance as one bomber fell, then another, then a third. He wanted to turn back and help, but he had no ammunition and barely enough fuel to reach base. The math was cruel again. Save yourself or die uselessly. Morrison chose to save himself and his flight. All 4 planes made it home. 15 bombers did not. The squadron commander said Morrison made the right choice. Morrison did not believe him. The bomber crews would not believe him either. But Morrison had learned something important. Sometimes the right choice felt terrible. Sometimes you had to accept losses to prevent bigger losses. Sometimes the fuel gauge reached zero, and you had to leave, no matter who needed you. Morrison hated that lesson, but he could not argue with the math. Dead fighter pilots helped no one. Living pilots could fight again tomorrow. Tomorrow came. And the day after. And the day after that. Morrison flew mission after mission. Bomber escort, fighter sweep, ground attack. He shot down more German fighters. He lost more pilots from his flight. New replacements arrived, younger and less experienced each time. Morrison taught them the lessons he had learned. Watch your fuel, watch your six. Stay close to your leader. Some listened, some did not. The ones who did not usually died within a week. The ones who listened lasted longer, sometimes a month or more. That was the difference between life and death. Listening to advice from someone who had survived. Morrison survived. He did not know why. Luck, skill, caution, some combination that kept him alive while others died. He stopped trying to figure it out. He just flew and fought and came home. Every landing was a small miracle. Every morning he woke up was a gift. Morrison learned to appreciate those gifts without thinking too hard about why he received them and others did not. Winter turned to spring. The war continued. Morrison kept flying. His flight changed composition constantly. Pilots rotated in and out, some completing their tours, some getting shot down, some transferring to other squadrons. Morrison remained constant. The experienced flight leader, the one who brought planes home more often than not. Other pilots looked up to him. Morrison found that strange. He did not feel like someone worth looking up to. He felt like someone who had gotten lucky enough times to still be breathing. But he kept the doubts to himself. His flight needed confidence, not uncertainty. So Morrison projected calm and competence. Even when he felt neither, he made decisions quickly, stuck to them, and lived with the consequences. That was leadership. Not brilliance or courage, just consistency and willingness to bear responsibility. Morrison could do that. He had no choice but to do that. In April, Morrison led a mission that tested everything he had learned. The briefing came at 05:00 hours. Morrison sat in the cold briefing room with 7 other pilots and listened to the intelligence officer explain the mission. It was ambitious. Escort 20 B-17 bombers to a target deep in Germany. Stay with them through the bomb run. Bring them home. The target was a factory complex near Munich. The distance was extreme. The round trip would take 3 hours at bomber speed. Morrison's P-47 carried enough fuel for 3.5 hours, if he flew conservatively and avoided extended combat. That left 30 minutes of margin. Not much. Simple plan on paper, but difficult execution in practice. The intelligence officer showed them expected enemy fighter concentrations. Heavy opposition anticipated along the entire route. German radar would track the formation from takeoff. Luftwaffe controllers would vector fighters to intercept. Morrison and his fellow flight leaders would have to fight continuously while managing fuel consumption. It was a razor-edge mission. One mistake, one prolonged engagement, one navigation error, and pilots would run out of fuel over Germany. Morrison asked about alternate landing fields. The intelligence officer pointed to several emergency strips in Belgium and France. Morrison noted their locations but knew the reality. If he diverted to an emergency field, he would abandon the bombers. That was not acceptable. He would make it home or crash trying. After the briefing, Morrison walked with his flight to their aircraft. Dawn was still an hour away. The field was dark except for hooded lights along the taxiway. Ground crews were finishing pre-flight checks. Morrison found his assigned P-47 and walked around it slowly, checking control surfaces, looking for hydraulic leaks, verifying the fuel caps were secured. Everything looked good. The plane was ready. Morrison climbed into the cockpit and began his personal checks. Instruments, radios, oxygen system, guns. He worked methodically, The same routine he had followed for hundreds of missions. The routine calmed him. It imposed order on chaos. Check the gauges, verify the systems, trust the machine. Morrison trusted his P-47. The plane had brought him home many times. It would bring him home today. He believed that. He had to believe that. His wingman called on the radio and asked about the mission. Morrison told him to fly close, conserve fuel, and stay alert. The wingman acknowledged. He sounded young, nervous. Morrison remembered being that young, that nervous. It felt like a lifetime ago, but it had only been 9 months. 9 months of combat flying aged pilots faster than years of peacetime. Morrison felt old at 24. He felt like he had been fighting this war forever. Maybe he had. Maybe there was no life before the war. Maybe the fuel gauges and the combat and the endless decisions had always existed. Morrison could barely remember what peace felt like. Engines started across the field. Morrison hit his starter. The engine coughed, caught, settled into a rough idle. He advanced the throttle slightly. The engine smoothed out. Oil pressure came up. Temperature gauges rose into the green. Morrison checked his fuel gauge one more time. 90 gallons, full tanks. He would watch that gauge closely today. It would tell him when to stay and when to leave. The gauge never lied. Numbers never lied. Math was the only truth in aerial combat. Everything else was hope and courage and luck. But the fuel gauge dealt in certainties. Morrison respected that. The flight taxied to the runway in the pre-dawn darkness. Morrison ran his final checks. Trim tabs set, flaps down 15 degrees, prop full forward, mixture rich. He advanced the throttle and felt the big radial engine respond. The P-47 accelerated down the runway, tail came up, and then Morrison was flying, climbing away from the field, leaving the ground behind. Below, runway lights stretched into the distance. Ahead, darkness. Morrison climbed toward the darkness and checked his fuel gauge. 88 gallons. Already burning fuel. The counting had begun. His flight formed up around him. 4 fighters, tight formation, climbing toward the bomber rendezvous point. Other flights joined them. 8 P-47s total, Morrison's element. They would escort 20 bombers deep into Germany and bring them home. Simple mission. Impossible odds. But that was every mission now. The bombers needed protection. Morrison and his pilots would provide it, or they would die trying. Those were the only options the war offered. The mission started well. Morrison's flight of 4 P-47s met the bombers over Belgium and escorted them east. German fighters appeared but stayed back, shadowing the formation, waiting for the right moment. Morrison kept his flight between the bombers and the enemy. The Germans did not attack. Everyone flew deeper into enemy territory. The bombers reached their target, a factory complex near Munich. They began their bomb run, flying straight and level, holding formation. That was when the German fighters struck. They came from every direction, dozens of them, overwhelming the escort. Morrison's flight split up to cover as many angles as possible. Morrison took 2 fighters and engaged 4 German planes diving on the lead bomber. He shot down one and damaged another. The remaining 2 broke off. But more German fighters kept coming. Morrison lost sight of his wingmen. His radio filled with overlapping voices, pilots calling for help, bomber gunners reporting attacks, everyone shouting at once. Morrison focused on his job. Stay between bombers and enemy. Shoot down threats. Keep moving. Do not let the Germans lock onto you. Basic tactics executed under impossible pressure. His fuel gauge read 60 gallons. Morrison checked the time. They still had to fly back across Germany, across Belgium, across the front lines. 90 minutes of flying at cruise speed. Morrison was not cruising. He was turning and climbing and diving and burning fuel 3 times faster than normal. Simple math. He would run out of fuel before reaching home. He could leave now and make it back safely. Or he could stay with the bombers and go down somewhere over Germany. Morrison stayed. He had made this choice before. The answer had not changed. The bombers finished their run and turned for home. German fighters followed them all the way to the German border, attacking constantly. Morrison's guns ran dry. He had nothing left to shoot. But he stayed with the bombers anyway, flying close, making the Germans think he still had ammunition. Sometimes the bluff worked. Sometimes German pilots broke off their attacks, rather than risk engaging what they thought was an armed fighter. Morrison used every trick he had learned, every lesson from every mission. He kept 3 bombers safe through sheer persistence and willingness to position his plane between them and danger. The German fighters finally broke off near the Belgian border. Morrison checked his fuel gauge. 20 gallons, 10 minutes of flying time. Friendly lines were 15 minutes away. The math was simple and final. Morrison would not make it home. He radioed the bomber lid and told him the situation. The bomber pilot thanked him and asked where Morrison would land. Morrison said he did not know yet. Somewhere flat and open. Maybe a field, maybe a road, wherever his engine quit. That was where he would land. Morrison flew west and looked for suitable landing sites. He saw a long, straight road below, empty of traffic. That would work. He set up his approach, dropping altitude, lining up with the road. His fuel gauge read 15 gallons. The engine coughed. It caught again, running rough, sucking the last drops from the tank. Morrison dropped his landing gear. The wheels locked down. He glided toward the road. The engine quit. Silence, except for wind. Morrison adjusted his glide, aiming for the middle of the road. Trees lined both sides. Narrow margins. He would have to be precise. The road rushed up. Morrison pulled back on his stick. The tail dropped. Wheels touched pavement. The P-47 bounced, rolled, slowed. Morrison steered straight, keeping the heavy fighter centered on the narrow road. Trees flashed past on both sides. The plane rolled to a stop. Morrison sat in the cockpit and looked around. He was on a road somewhere in Belgium, friendly territory, but barely. German patrols still operated in this area. He needed to get moving. Morrison climbed out and looked at his plane. No major damage, just empty fuel tanks and worn guns. The plane had done its job. Now Morrison needed to do his get back to friendly forces before the Germans found him. He started walking west. After 2 miles, he found an Allied checkpoint. American soldiers surprised to see a pilot on foot, but professional enough not to ask stupid questions. They gave him a ride to the nearest base. Morrison reported in, filed his report, and waited for transport back to his squadron. It took 2 days. By the time Morrison returned, his squadron had already flown 6 more missions without him. 2 more pilots were dead. 4 more planes were damaged. The war had not paused just because Morrison was walking through Belgium. The squadron commander welcomed Morrison back and told him he was being promoted. Morrison said he did not want a promotion. The commander said too bad. Morrison was getting one anyway. Flight leader was no longer sufficient. Morrison was now an element leader, responsible for 2 flights, 8 planes, 8 pilots, double the responsibility, double the weight. Morrison accepted because he had no choice. The war needed experienced officers. Morrison was experienced, therefore Morrison led. He led well. Not brilliantly, not fearlessly, but competently. He kept more pilots alive than dead. He completed more missions than he failed. That was the measure of success. Ratios and percentages. Morrison's ratios were better than average. That made him valuable. The squadron relied on him. Other pilots trusted him. Morrison carried that trust like extra weight in the cockpit, pulling him down, making every decision harder. But he carried it anyway. What else could he do? May arrived. The war was clearly ending. Everyone could feel it. German resistance weakened daily. Luftwaffe fighters appeared less frequently. The missions grew easier, but easier did not mean safe. Morrison still lost pilots. He still watched fuel gauges count down. He still made impossible choices about staying or leaving. The end was visible, but it remained out of reach. Morrison flew toward it, mission by mission, day by day, trying to survive long enough to see it arrive. On May 7th, Morrison flew his last combat mission. He did not know it was his last when he took off that morning. The briefing was routine: escort bombers to a target in western Germany. Standard procedure. Morrison led 8 fighters up to meet 20 bombers. They flew east together. German fighters appeared, only 6 of them, poorly coordinated. Morrison's element shot down 3 and scattered the rest. The bombers reached their target unopposed, dropped their bombs and turned for home. Morrison brought all 8 fighters back safely. Perfect mission. Clean execution. No losses. That night, the war ended. Germany surrendered. The fighting stopped. Morrison heard the news and felt nothing. No relief, no joy, no satisfaction. Just emptiness. He had survived. That was supposed to mean something. It did not feel like it meant anything. Morrison was alive and many others were not, and the reasons for that disparity were arbitrary and unfair. Morrison did not deserve to survive more than his wingman who had died over Belgium 8 months ago. He was just luckier. That was all survival came down to: luck and timing and random chance. The squadron celebrated. Pilots drank and laughed and talked about going home. Morrison sat in his quarters and stared at the wall. Someone came to his room and said he should join the party. Morrison said he would come soon. He did not go. He sat alone and thought about fuel gauges and dead pilots and impossible choices. The war was over, but those memories remained. They would always remain. Morrison knew that now. The fuel gauge in his mind would always read low, even when the tanks were full. The math would always feel wrong, even when the numbers added up. He had learned too many lessons that could not be unlearned. Eventually, Morrison got up and joined the party. He smiled and drank, and pretended to celebrate. Other pilots saw him and cheered. The experienced element leader, the pilot who brought everyone home, the man who had survived when so many others had not. Morrison accepted their praise and said nothing about the truth. The truth was too heavy to share at a party. The truth was that survival felt like failure, like undeserved fortune, like winning a lottery he had never wanted to enter. But he kept those thoughts to himself and raised his glass and toasted victory with men who thought victory meant something clear and good and final. The war ended. Morrison went home. He left the P-47 behind, left the squadron behind, left the fuel gauges and the combat and the impossible choices. He tried to leave the memories behind too, but they followed him. Every time he started a car, he checked the fuel gauge. Every time he made a decision, he calculated the odds and the costs and the consequences. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw German fighters climbing toward him, saw bombers falling, saw fuel needles dropping towards zero. The war was over, but the war was not over. Not for Morrison, not ever. Years later, Morrison stood in a museum and looked at a restored P-47. The plane was beautiful, gleaming silver, every detail perfect. A plaque said it was the same model Morrison had flown. Morrison stared at the fuel gauge in the cockpit. It read full, 90 gallons. Enough for 2 hours of flying. Enough to fight, enough to run, enough to make impossible choices and live with the consequences. Morrison touched the glass canopy and remembered what it felt like to sit in that seat, to watch that gauge count down, to know with mathematical certainty that the numbers would not work out. He remembered the choice he made at 9,000 feet over Belgium: stay with the bombers or save himself. He remembered choosing to stay. He remembered surviving. A young boy stood next to Morrison and asked if he had flown fighters in the war. Morrison said yes. The boy asked what it was like. Morrison thought about that question. What was it like? How could he explain it to someone who had never watched a fuel gauge count down while enemy fighters climbed toward him? How could he describe the weight of responsibility, The impossibility of the choices, the arbitrary nature of survival. Morrison could not explain those things. So he said something simple instead. He said it was dangerous, but necessary. He said a lot of good men had died doing their job. He said he was lucky to survive. The boy nodded, satisfied with the answer, and walked away. Morrison stayed at the exhibit a while longer, looking at that fuel gauge reading full, wishing it had always read full, wishing the numbers had always worked out, wishing impossible choices had been possible after all, but wishes changed nothing. The gauge was what it was. The choices were what they were. Morrison had survived them. That was enough. It had to be enough, because nothing else was possible, not then and not now. The war was over, but the memories remained, and Morrison carried them forward into peacetime like fuel in a tank that never quite emptied, never quite filled, just existed somewhere in between, counting down and counting up in endless silence.